and welcome to the Mediatwits number 153. I'm Mark Glazer, Executive Editor of PBS Media Shift. This week we're going to be talking about venture capital funding for digital media startups and digital media sites. There's been a big rise in that funding over the last year or two. The question is it sustainable, and will these companies pay off in the end, especially after in the wake of GigaOM closing down in the last couple of weeks? So the question is VC funding the way to go for digital media startups or not? Before we get into our discussion, I want to thank our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And I am coming to you from the Potrero Hill NextSpace and NextKids, and my one-year-old son Everett is next door at NextKids. Before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel. We have Andrew Lee from American University, Kim Bui from Reportedly, Peter Kafka from Recode, our producer Jefferson Yen in Los Angeles. So there's been this big, over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of funding go into some of these digital media native publishers. BuzzFeed has raised now $96 million. Refinery 29, which is focused on millennial women, is trying to raise $50 million. Peter, tell us what's sexy about these companies. Why are VCs attracted to these kind of digital native publishers?
VCs are putting money into lots of stuff, so there's a lot of money going into startups in general. So, I mean, we're the media world, so we do a lot of navel gazing, so I think we overinflate how much interest there is in this stuff. I mean, they're pretty minor sums compared to what's going into the Ubers and Dropboxes and Airbnbs of the world. And by the way, these companies have relatively small valuations, too. I mean, BuzzFeed isn't a unicorn yet. All that said, the big premise is, hey, we're at an inflection point. The TV guys and traditional media folks are going to go away. They're going to be disrupted. We're going to create new media companies that replace them. If you really go for the scale argument, this is the BuzzFeed argument, you say the fact that everyone's got a mobile phone and communicates via social is going to expand that world in a way that the Time Incs of the world and Time Warner cables of the world could only imagine. And that's why there's a big opportunity to make a really big company here, hence the justification for VC money.
In other words, if they can become the Time Inc. of the future or the New York Times or whatever, then there's the opportunity. But
right. Well, 2015 is much bigger than that. You have to say much bigger than those companies.
The next Facebook, the next Google.
Yeah.
And is that possible? I mean, can someone creating, let's say, original content, original journalism, whatever you want to call it, it can be expensive to create that. It's not, Facebook is just a platform.
The traditional reason why VCs haven't funded media is that it doesn't scale. If you want to make another blog post or another movie or even another Snapchat story, someone has to make that thing. It's not software where you can make it once and replicate it many times. An enterprise software business where you can sell it to a bunch of people, make one thing once and sell it to a bunch of people. So traditionally they've avoided content for that reason because it doesn't really scale. And I don't think, by the way, the BuzzFeeds of the world have a really good answer for that other than they're very big. They now have the additional challenge of having to make advertisements by hand as well to fit with the native ad rage that we're in right now. They keep having to hire. BuzzFeed keeps expanding their office space. They double pretty much every year. Every time I go see them, they're in a new office space in New York. So there is a real question about whether this stuff actually scales or if it just gets bigger.
Yeah. When you talk about big, you're talking about page views and size of audience. You're not talking about big as far as revenues necessarily.
No, I mean all of the above. But the idea is, the reason a VC traditionally funds something is they say, once we've put in a certain amount of money, this thing grows, geometrically. It's not a one-to-one ratio. But usually in content, if you want to make more content, you have to go hire another person to make it. If you want to sell more ads, you have to hire someone to go sell those ads. And no one really has solved that problem yet. Which may be a good thing for me, by the way.
Definitely. So, Kim, tell us about some of the advantages of these kind of online-only publications versus kind of the traditional ones that came out of radio, came out of TV, came out of print. What is there an advantage in these kind of digital natives as far as playing in social media, being online?
I think so. I mean, you have a better chance of finding an audience. I mean, if we're looking at GigaOM, despite all of their business and problems running the company, they had a great audience, and all of their writers knew how to talk to the people that they were writing for. I mean, there are a lot of tech people that relied on GigaOM on a daily basis. So at the very least, they had their niche set, and I think that is smart in terms of social media. They did a great job with it, and I would rarely go a day without seeing a GigaOM link somewhere on my feed. So I think there's something there that is smart. I mean, you need to have both parts. You need to have the audience and the business plan to make a business succeed. But everyone's missing something in the sense they had a figured out audience. They just maybe didn't figure out anything else.
Yeah, Alex, did you want to jump in there on kind of the tech angle? Because I know some of these venture-funded companies kind of say, hey, with Vox specifically, they've got this CMS that they've built and so on. I mean, can media companies like this say that they're really tech companies?
I think that that's their selling point. To Peter's point about the scalability, I think a lot of the press and the PR and the marketing dollars they've spent has been around positioning themselves as tech companies and not media companies for that reason. So as you said, Vox with its editorial tools, Mashable with Velocity, BuzzFeed with its platform and kind of like charting the web and its own internal analytics systems and things like that have at least tried to make things more scalable. And I think the common denominator among these companies is they focused first and foremost on editorial products as opposed to UX. Like BuzzFeed's pretty ugly site, it's not like a design-heavy site, as is the Huffington Post. Those things were built from editorial tech tools, as opposed to, a bright and shiny thing built on a terrible CMS.
And do you buy that, Andrew, about them kind of positioning themselves as tech companies? I mean, is it true? Are they really kind of tech companies, or is this just a way to get VC funding?
Yeah, I think there's no one consistent formula across these different firms. I think one of the things that when I teach in media entrepreneurship here at American U, the first thing we try to get students who are pitching a idea, a concept, a startup, is to say the classic Silicon Valley line. What is your unfair advantage? What's your secret sauce? What's your magic pixie dust that no one else can replicate? And if you look at folks like Recode, it's this track record that Walt Mossberg and company have built up over the years, and they can actually do a conference and reliably get folks. For other folks to try to do that would be extremely hard, and you saw that with GigaOM in trying to do conferences and not being positioned to do that and being a money drain. So for some folks it might be platform and technology, for some it might be access, for some it might be partnerships that no one else can replicate. So I think you're going to see it from different dimensions. One of the things that I consistently point to as a company that's fascinating is something like Slate. And I think between the last time we talked about Slate and today, they've launched a new podcast network in Panoply. And that's a great example of how they take a product that is fairly cheap to make, have magnified that to a larger and larger audience and a larger and larger set of shows that they make. And then their unfair advantage is that they've got special relationships, right? So Jacob Weisberg, Joe Weisberg are brothers, so therefore the guy who makes the Americans TV show has this extremely valuable kind of post-show podcast that Slate does, and Slate has been able to get folks like Inc. and New York Magazine and everything under that new Panoply podcast network, and that's really great stuff, and they can lock that up and be known for that. And I think each of these firms that want to try to stand out has to try to do something like that. to have that unfair advantage. And GigaOM in the end became kind of commodity. Like, did I read that story in GigaOM or Recode or in Mashable? I can't even remember. Like, I never.
There's a lot of tech. There's a lot of tech sites out there.
Right. So they're a commodity, and they didn't find a way to stand out and say, you need to visit us. Right.
Peter, what impresses you out of all these kind of VC-funded companies? I mean, is there something specific you think stands out as far as differentiation, saying like, hey, this is different than everyone else? So what do you see? What impresses you?
Well, I think the two of the sites, the companies that people are most impressed with because they have the highest valuations and have raised the most money are Vice and BuzzFeed. And they often get compared to each other for good reason, in addition to being sexy and millennial, and they have charismatic founders. Their ad models are that of their business model is that of an ad agency, first and foremost. Their main job is that people who are advertisers pay them a lot of money to go create content, and then they go place it in front of people. And that's their core business. You would think that, traditionally ad agencies don't go for very high multiples, so it's interesting that those are sort of sexy to VCs right now, but they're much more of a Young and Rubicam than they are sort of a New York Times. They happen to create a lot of content that you could view for free that isn't necessarily attached to ads, but their core business is working with Intel or Purina and creating stuff for those people specifically and then distributing in front of eyeballs.
Right, and the distribution models there are also interesting to me because as Facebook and other social networks want to own your content, as we saw this week with Facebook's announcement that they're going to host New York Times content, etc., it doesn't really matter for BuzzFeed and Vice where the content lives because it's a product integration play and it's a native advertising play, so they don't have as much to lose as people that are dependent on display advertising in the same way. So the referral clicks doesn't matter. Like if Vice is doing a thing with Honda in which their gonzo journalists are like driving through Chile on Honda motorcycles, does it really matter if it lives in the Facebook player or their own player?
Yeah, the really interesting statistic that the BuzzFeed video people make, and BuzzFeed video, by the way, is becoming kind of the most important part of that company, is that only 5% of their views happen on BuzzFeed.com. The rest are all on Facebook and YouTube. So this notion that like hosting content on Facebook is controversial is a non-controversy for BuzzFeed, and they were actually last week out there saying that at South by Southwest. But it's already a done deal for them. They do not care where you see their stuff or where you see their ads at least.
Well, and that's the difference between them and an ad agency. Is an ad agency doesn't have 50 million people viewing their stuff all over the place. I mean, if they can be an ad agency,
they do. They just buy airtime, right? This is a different way of getting airtime. It's a really interesting way, but that is what they do. They take the money and then they go find distribution for it.
Right, but it's cutting out the agency in a way because if you want to buy airtime, you go to an ad agency to create the ad and then you put it on the networks. This is the networks actually creating the ads, right?
No, it's closer to them being the ad agency that takes the money to make the creative and then goes to find a place for that stuff to live. In the case of Facebook and YouTube, by the way, they're spending some money to get that stuff eyeballs as well. It's not exactly one-to-one, but it's much closer to that model than it is to a traditional media business.
Yeah. Kim, I'm curious, what do you think about kind of the future of all these kind of native ads and studios at every publication? I mean, even New York Times and traditional players now are creating their own studios. I mean, will all journalists kind of have to learn how to become kind of ad creatives too?
I think it depends on where you work and what you set readers up to look for, I think. BuzzFeed, for example, is a great example. All of the videos that I see on Facebook that are native advertising, that are BuzzFeed, I don't care because BuzzFeed's already set me up for that. That's just, they're very open about it. They know it's going to be a lot tougher for someone like the New York Times to be like, we've separated ads and content for a long time, and now we're going to mix them in, and you're going to have to figure it out. I think that's going to a lot tougher sell to their audience, which is a lot larger and storied, than it is for BuzzFeed to just come out of the gate and say that. For a lot of like digital-only companies, it's a lot easier because they can move quicker and faster than somebody with a lot of history. I think history of audience and history of expectation count for a lot when we talk about this kind of stuff.
And what about, I mean, it does feel like, at least being out here in San Francisco, it does feel like another bubble happening Andrew, do you feel like something is going to kind of poke this bubble at some point? I mean, how many meerkats can we possibly have?
I didn't think there was a bubble last year in San Francisco, but I'm increasingly thinking that way with evictions and luxury buses and things like that headlining the San Francisco scene these days. I don't know. There are some properties that are probably worth the $5 to $10 billion that are being floated about in terms of valuations, but I think a correction of some. I would not be surprised with some correction of some sort. I don't think it's going to reach the 90s level of correction, but I think certainly there's a lot of fat to be trimmed at some point.
Yeah, and it seems like if these aren't the real main money makers for VCs, then these might be the first to get hurt, some of these digital media companies that are VC funded.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing for content plays, if you don't need to sink money into a lot of platform work, is to just don't take on debt, right? That was kind of the killer for any kind of content company. And what Kim and Andy Carvin are doing out there, they're using Medium as the platform. They're putting all the resources behind the reporting and the insights. They're going that complete opposite direction, but the platform is something that's switchable underneath them, and they're really not investing in that, as their sunk costs.
Right, there really isn't a place for reportedly. It doesn't have its own site. It just lives on social media or wherever on Medium.
Right.
So it doesn't really have a place, which maybe that is the future of some of these publishers that don't have to have a big homepage. I mean, Kim, does it feel weird not having that place to call home, being a wandering content producer?
I don't think it's that weird. I mean, when we first started talking about this, not even reportedly, just this concept in general, it was when I was a social media editor and we were talking about not posting the same thing to Facebook and Twitter and to kind of readjusting, something I ended up calling like platform intelligence. And this is just hyped up platform intelligence, what we're seeing now. If Now This News doesn't need a homepage, because I don't even remember ever going to Now This News' homepage, and I can't remember the last time I typed in BuzzFeed.com or NYTimes.com. I find their stuff through other places. I think it sets you up to be a lot more flexible, and yes, it is a lot cheaper to run a company that way. I think it's a lot tougher sell if you're doing long form or really in-depth reporting to find a really good place outside of Medium for that sort of thing. But it might happen. I mean, you can do in-depth reporting on Snapchat, maybe. We'll see.
It disappears after the end of the day, of course.
Yeah.
What do you? I mean, Alex, this obviously is your wheelhouse in the audience development. I mean, this is content promiscuity the future of content, basically?
I like the term content promiscuity, but other than that, I think that this is all going to come down to the business models and whether people can sustain this. And I think that what we saw with GigaOM is it didn't pan out, and we're in this weird time that we can't stop navel gazing about, as Peter mentioned, about like, how is this going to work? How is this going to survive? Like, are we going to lose everything? Is this going to be better? Is it going to be worse? And as we adapt to new technology, there's always this risk of losing out on what you did right in the past for the better experience or get a better experience in the future. I think the reality is that the business model of putting display ads against things and that being the end of the day is not sustainable. So the BuzzFeed and Mashable and other companies that are becoming this like brand centric thing, they're onto something, but that can't apply to all publishers. That can't be the solution. There have to be other solutions out there. So I have yet to see one that would help more than just a niche group of publishers, and I think that's the problem.
Can I just interject for a second? We talk a lot about business models, but the thing with GigaOM, right, is their business model may or may not have worked. It doesn't matter. They're really poorly managed, and I don't think it should be a referendum on whether you should take on a certain amount of VC funding or whether or not you should take on debt. Those are all mechanisms that, if you apply them correctly, could work conceivably. I don't know when GigaOM broke. I don't know if it was always broken. It was clearly broken for at least the last year before it failed. And you could tell that because the people who were investing in it kept pouring more money into it, which would evaporate immediately. Yet they didn't lay anybody off or have any kind of cuts. They seem to have literally no one steering that ship. I mean, they didn't have a CEO for 3 months, but even prior to that, I don't know what the board was doing. I don't know what the investors were thinking. No one on staff there knew the thing was headed for a brick wall, which is also very telling in multiple ways. So, GigaOM, for what had many good things about it, but it was a poorly run company for at least a year before it died. So I'd be wary of sort of using it as an example of what does or doesn't work about content. It was a badly run business.
True, and you did a great report on that too, Peter. But Rafat Ali, who started paid content and did get some funding. I mean, he now in his second startup with Skift is saying, VC funding shouldn't be the first thing you do. That it's not, and there's downsides to it too, right?
Yeah, but again,
you've got expectations thrown on you.
You're just talking about running a business. Some businesses should get VC funding. Some should get friends and family. Some should be bootstrapped. Most of them, statistically, by the way, will fail. And none of them will work if they're not well run. So I don't really, it's fun to talk about business models, but it's the reality of actually running a business is hard, period, and it's not something you can sort of figure out in the salon. You have to sort of do it at the actual business.
I mean, do you think what are the downsides of taking VC funding if someone's starting something out? I mean, when does it make sense to do it?
If you think you have a business that is going to scale and give someone 10x outsized return, you can run lots of really good, profitable businesses without taking on investors who want that kind of return. People make a lot of money that way. But if you're taking on venture capital, the idea is you're going to produce something that has one of those crazy hockey stick curves. Probably most media companies aren't going to produce that. If you want to have the business model discussion, but again, it's not really relevant if you can't run the business.
Just as a note, HuffPost, was VC funded, and when I was there, and then was sold to AOL, there's different plays. I mean, in terms of the 10x model, I don't think the expectation was ever that HuffPost was going to make a ton of money. I think the expectation was always that it was going to be sold.
Yeah, again, depends on who you talk to there. A bunch of people there said, no, we could have gone and IPO'd, and we sold. Yeah. Ariana wanted to sell, and by the way, some of those people now work at BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were, I think, different motivations for running a company. And by the way, that deal worked out really well for lots of people. I just spent part of yesterday talking with the guys at Viral Nova. He's sort of the son of Upworthy site that blew up last year on Facebook and is now smaller, but still big. And that was a one-person company in Cleveland. And for some reason, they decided to spend a bunch of money, open up in New York, hire writers in New York. It seems like a really weird strategy to me because they had a really profitable business when it was one guy in Ohio. My instinct would be to stay in Ohio and make a lot of money that way. But they're going to try this new model. By the way, their offices are in the old offices of what used to be called Policy Mike.
Yes.
Yet another VC-backed content company. So we are having a moment.
I think, Andrew, your next class should be named One Kid in Cleveland.
No, what Peter says is true. I think what happens with VC money as part of the dynamic is the clock and the timeline is no longer yours to determine completely, right? And that's the big thing. And as Peter perfectly said, if you've got a good management team, you can work with those VCs to make sure it works. But if you don't have a good team, then you're really in bad shape because you're not in control of your fate timeline-wise, right? So when we teach students here about what funding model, your best bet obviously is, as Peter said, friends, angels, folks who believe in the product and will help you craft the product and are not just looking for the dollar signs at the end of the rainbow. Not only will they give you money, but they'll give you advice. They will be your advocates. They'll be the folks trying to fight for your company versus other folks who are just waiting to get their money back from their investment, right?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how this does shake out because all the money being thrown there something's going to happen with it, and we don't really know. And each case will obviously be different, but we'll definitely be watching it. I want to thank our panel, Alex Leo joining us from Yahoo, Andrew Lee at American University, Kim Bowie from Reportedly, Peter Kafka at Recode, our producer Jefferson Yen. I want to thank our sponsor NextSpace and NextKids. You can learn about their program at nextspace.us/nextkids. You can catch us every week on the Mediatwits at PBS Mediashift at pbs.org/mediashift. We'll catch you next week.